Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Richie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks, that's Al Cinders against Bellamy.
It has Jordan. Allen shakes free. Gets two!
Gilmore on a big stop. Brother. Lead Toledo artists. You get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Barry.
Jordan. Open. Chicago with the lead.
Hello, and welcome back to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason Mann. With me, as always, is Rich Kraetsch, and we have Jared Dubin returning with us. He is an editor emeritus at Hardwood Paroxysm and host of Quo Vadis on this very network. Jared Dubin, welcome back to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me for, I think, the fourth time now, guys. I appreciate it.
he's been here more than I have. It's essentially his show. I'm the guest, really, at this point.
There you go. So we are going to talk about the top 50 case for Kevin Johnson. Some of the overall numbers: he is 94th in win shares all time, 41st in win shares per 48, 91st in box score plus minus, and 109th in value over replacement player. He was 4 times on the All-NBA second team, once on the third team. He has 4 top 10 seasons in win shares per 48. He is 6th all-time in assists per game, 9th in assist percentage. He is 93rd on the Bill Simmons Book of Basketball Pyramid of Players, and he is 102nd in the Slam Magazine Top 500. Certainly tremendous point guard, probably not as well regarded as he should be, especially if you look at the kind of his numbers compared to some of the other great point guards of all time. Jared, I know KJ's one of your favorite players, but what do you think about his case for the top 50?
I think it's very, very similar to the guy I came on last time to talk about, Tracy McGrady, where it's an outside case just based on the career he had in the NBA, and he would have a better argument if it were a top 50 talents in NBA history discussion. Much like T-Mac, he had a couple of years at both the beginning and end of his career where, for various reasons, he didn't play all that much. As a rookie, KJ, I think, played, I'm looking at it now, 24 minutes a game, and then in the last 2 years of his career, which were riddled by injury, last 3 years of his career, he played a total of 56 games, including a year where he missed the entire season. And then in between that, he had a 9-season peak where he averaged 20 points and 10 assists a game, was one of the handful of best point guards in the league, consistently in the top 5. But never really a guy where you thought he was the single best point guard in the league. And I think that's sort of what holds him back in the discussion a little bit.
I think one of the things that I, of doing research of Kevin Johnson and looking at video and everything of that, it's remarkable, and we'll go over some of the stats here in a little bit, where he really stands out more than you would almost kind of think just by, if I told you, hey, tell me about Kevin Johnson or whatever, you wouldn't think, you probably wouldn't put him in the category that he really deserves to be in when you look at his overall stats. One thing as well, just watching him play and just seeing how ahead of his time he really was in a lot of ways. Pro Hoops History, obviously Curtis Harris, who's been on this podcast many, many times, wrote a great piece on ProHoopsHistory.com about Kevin Johnson, just talks about just the culture shock of seeing a guy, a point guard who's a great passer. I mean, just an unbelievable passer that could throw it down as well as he could. Like, his dunks are just incredible of what he was able to do and how ferocious he could be. And, we kind of take it for granted now because we have guys like, pre-injury Derrick Rose or like a Russell Westbrook, and that's just kind of commonplace for those guys to do it. But I mean, you can see the culture shock even when Kevin Johnson does it, and the announcers and the fans and the teammates are just like, holy crap, like this guy who could just as easily throw a great bounce pass can just just throw and dunk it over Hakeem Olajuwon. Like it's unbelievable in that respect. And when you watch these videos, it's crazy how much it stands out and how much he just flies, and especially in traffic too. Is how unique it is that he doesn't need a fast break or a whole lot of space to really be able to rise and dunk. Like he can do it over guys, he can do it in traffic. It's really incredible.
Well, I think that KJ, it's interesting that you brought up Westbrook, because I think that KJ is sort of what people envision when, they talk about the balance that Westbrook needs to strike between, being his usual hyper-aggressive, ferocious self, and also, putting the full, display of the full array of his passing gifts on display as well. I think KJ struck that balance really well. He was a guy who, again, he averaged 20 points and 10 assists a game over the course of 8 or 9 years, shot almost 50% from the floor during that time too, and I think was taking 14, 15 shots a night. Westbrook obviously tilts a little bit more towards the 25 and 8 with a few extra shots direction, and I think that that's sort of what people envision him being when they say, oh, he needs to pass a little bit more. I think it would remind you a lot of what KJ was, not just in terms of the way he played, but also the athletic gifts, in terms of the sheer, like, the athleticism in the same way that Westbrook's does sort of oozed out of his pores. And there were times where he surprised you with the explosion that he had dunking over people.
Yeah, one thing that I think that isn't well remembered is, from his second season on, he was traded to Phoenix in middle of '88 season. And then from 89 to 92, he was either one or two minutes leaders and probably the best player on those Suns teams. And those Suns teams before Barkley was on there were really good teams. And, they had Tom Chambers and they had they Jeff Hornacek, and they had other guys who were pretty good. Dan Marley, of course. So it wasn't just KJ's show, but he was he was kind of leading that attack, and those teams were really good in a competitive Western Conference. They had a couple of playoff disappointments, but they made the 1990 Western Conference Finals. They beat the Lakers in in the semis. The first Lakers team to not make the finals in forever. They really, I think young Kevin Johnson, kind of before the injuries started to take their toll and, kind of some of the other issues. And like I said, was just a dynamic player and was really just an incredible force. I guess the question is, is that quite enough given the depth that we have at point guard?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Because again, like we talked about, with T-Mac, the candle burned very bright, but it didn't burn for that long. I think if he had more seasons on either side of his peak where he was just a good player as opposed to what he was when he was at his best, then he'd have a stronger case. His all-time numbers would be, a little bit higher, things like that. You look at he wound up with, just over 13,000 points and 6,700 assists. Those are not necessarily numbers that you think of, for all-time 50 greatest players. But that's, a lot of that is because he had just one season, before his prime, and then once his prime was done, so was his career. He didn't have, a second act of his career like, say, Vince Carter did, or, he didn't have that, like Gary Payton did, who we talked about as one of the better point guards of, pretty much the same era, and became more of a shoo-in case because he had a whole nother aspect of his career where he played crucial roles on, really good teams and teams that won the championship, and was able to extend the life of his effectiveness, despite not being quite as good as he was before.
Real quick, before we kind of move on here, I wanted to look at, as we do in all these podcasts, is look at how he rates position-wise and era-wise and all that sort of stuff. And this is where he really jumped out at the board with me, and I was just kind of shocked at how well he held up. Era and position, he's 13th in points per 36, 3rd in assists per 36, 42nd in effective field goal percentage, but what he really stands out, 2nd in win shares per 48, 4th in win shares, then 9th in value over replacement player. And then you look at all-time position-wise, 59th points per 36, 6th in assists per 36, 9th in win shares per 48, 21st in win shares, and 29th in value over replacement players. So he, as far as guards go all time, and especially point guards, I mean, that we talk about a guy who pretty much in all the big stats or all the big sort of advanced stuff, he's a top 30 guy in pretty much all of them, and that's remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, he was so good for the time that he was good. And, it's sort of unfortunate that his career basically ended at age 30. Like I said, after that, he played 56 total games. He was sort of, wrecked by injuries. And even for a few years before that, he was dealing with injuries a lot too. But he was still, incredible while he was on the floor during that time.
Yeah, we looked sort of at side by side with a few guys who we kind of put at a similar place in the pecking order. These guys are probably all maybe ahead of him, but just kind of looking at some guys who were, I think, just decent guys to just look at in the surface. Bob Cousy, Hal Greer, Jason Kidd, Steve Nash, and Gary Payton. And, I was kind of surprised that there were some things about him that stood out. He led them all in win shares per 48. He led them all in PER. He was second in true shooting percentage by a landslide next to Nash. The one skill that really stood out to me, which I never really thought much about, was his free throw rate. He was really able to get to the line at a high rate and was really able to, that really kind of stood out as well. So the negative for that is that his long minutes played are by far the least. I mean, he has half the career minutes played of Jason Kidd, basically. So it kind of presents both sides of that. But I do think that I think for me overall for KJ is that there is a case, and it's a surprisingly good case, but it's probably not quite enough just because, there's a lot of great point guards out there, and, he's just going to end up kind of being stacked behind those guys for the most part. I mean, he's definitely worth thinking about, and I'm glad that we have a discussion about him. He's just a fun guy to have watched played and just a fun guy to talk about, but I do think probably he's going to fall short.
Yeah, I think that you were onto something at the beginning when you said that he was sort of before his time. In this era of attacking point guards that we have now, he would have been, imagine him having sort of free reign towards the paint that he didn't really have throughout the 90s. He already sort of set that kind of mold for the attacking point guard in terms of, getting to the rim. So many of his shots were close. He didn't take a lot of threes at all. And I think that was why he sort of lived at the free throw line. And if he had the kind of access to the paint that players have now because of the way the hand checking rules have changed, I think he would have been, even more so at the line, which is pretty crazy to think about for a point guard that, for almost a decade was at the line 6-7 times a game, or, a few years up there he was at 8 times a game.
It's unbelievable. It's just
that's not something you would have heard of from point guards at that time.
It's that's the biggest thing when I was kind of looking through his stats and looking at his numbers. It was like, oh my god, like I couldn't believe it. Like I thought it was an error, that I was looking at the wrong thing. Like maybe what was that per 100 possessions? I was like, no, that's like per game. Was like it's just because it's on. I mean, we talk about other guys. Look at comps like Jason mentioned, guys like a Steve Nash or Jason Kidd or whatever, guys who were just as good at getting the line and scoring near the basket or whatever, and they're 2 a game, 3 a game tops, and you have a guy getting 6 a game. It's just unheard of for a point guard. Those are shooting guard numbers, and he was such a good passer too to boot. It's just it's unbelievable, his skill set, and it's a shame we don't sort of recognize him as more than he is, and he just sort of is kind of a fleeting guy. I mean, he's not even, when we talk about those Suns teams, we think of Barkley, I think, first off, before we think of him. And that's kind of unbelievable when you think of the longevity that he had there and what he was able to accomplish there before Barkley even went there. And then what he was able to accomplish, when Barkley was there. He was still, a vital part of that. And then another interesting thing, too, is if you look at the post-Barkley Suns, he goes right back to what he was doing kind of before Barkley was there, averages 20 a game or whatever. It's just an awesome career that, unfortunately, just the injuries just derailed it immediately, and then there was just nothing left.
It's interesting that you brought up, that everybody thinks about Barkley on those teams. Because I was, too young to catch early KJ, like the first 4 or 5 years of his career. But I guess it was the 93 finals was the first time I ever watched that team. Because I was six years old still at the time. But the Knicks had lost to the Bulls in the Eastern Conference Finals. And, before that, I had, once the Knicks were out, it was like, okay, I thought the season was over at that point. But, that year, during the Eastern Conference Finals, there was a game like, either on my birthday or the day before my birthday, whatever it was, that, I was still 6 years old at the time. These games are being played at night. But because it was my birthday, my dad was like, okay, you can stay up and watch this game. This was earlier in the playoffs because my birthday's in the beginning of May. But, when the finals came around and I found out that there was another basketball game on that night, it was my dad's birthday. And I reasoned with him that because I was allowed to stay up late to watch a basketball game on my birthday, that I should also be able to do the same thing on his birthday. Even at 6 years old, I had very flimsy logic. But, that night of my dad's birthday was that game in the 93 finals that went to 2 overtimes, 3 overtimes, whatever it was. And I just remembered this guy, Kevin Johnson, having the ball for them like the whole game. Like he all he did was score and he must have taken like 25, 30 shots in the game and had like 10 assists or something like that. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I remember just screams about Kevin Johnson, Kevin Johnson, Kevin Johnson. And I was like, to my dad, like, who is this guy? And he's like, that's Kevin Johnson. So then all I would do was, for the rest of the finals, was talk about Kevin Johnson and ask my dad what Kevin Johnson did in those games. And that was how he sort of became, a guy that I liked, was just because I had randomly stayed up for this one game that my dad let me stay up for when I was 6 years old. Unfortunately, that was sort of the last time in his career that he was fully healthy, and I found out later that he had not even been fully healthy during that season. He had missed a bunch of games, but that was a guy that I just loved the way that he played, and it came out in that game, and that was true throughout the rest of his career when he was healthy too. So I didn't even initially think about Barkley on those teams, to get back in a roundabout way to the point that I was making, just because I was this young kid who happened to watch this one game where KJ was doing pretty much everything.
Rich, anything else?
I think that's it for me on KJ. He's going to be an interesting one. I kind of put him up after this. I put him up on an interesting list of guys that I definitely want to talk about and look at a little bit more. I mean, a lot of these guys we've talked about, I've sort of said, yeah, they're on the fence, or that he's a guy. I don't know. I really, after today and after doing a lot of research and talking to different people and looking at the highlights and his stats, he's a guy that I think you can make a legit claim of being on that list in some form or fashion. So as we get closer, I'll have to see, what space pertains and who we'd have to go over or who we'd have to take out. But he really did. I mean, I was shocked. I was really, really shocked at how well he holds up.
Yeah,
his rate stats, I think, do a lot for him because, like you said, he didn't play that many minutes, but he was so productive. It's sort of his lack of longevity, hurts in terms of his all-time numbers, but helps in the fact that his rate stats look really good.
Yeah, I'm on board with you, Rich. I mean, I do think that he's definitely a guy who's going to be in the mix when we're making those final cuts, and he's definitely he's worth talking about. I'm also impressed by his production. I guess maybe there's a small benefit to the fact that he didn't stick around too long after he started to decline. I mean, once he started to decline, I mean, he basically, he had 56 games in a couple of seasons where, he didn't produce much or play well, and that was basically it. So he didn't have like a bad part of his career to drag those things down like some of the other players who might, maybe like McGrady or Chris Webber, guys who played a large number of minutes and weren't as good anymore. So, but either way, he'll definitely be in the conversation, like we said. Jared, anything else?
No, I think that's it. It's always fun to talk about KJ just because he was such a fun guy to watch. I think it's interesting to see how people will react to him because it's so hard to extricate KJ the player from KJ the Sacramento mayor who saved basketball in Sacramento, but also as a politician a lot of people have very strong feelings about and not necessarily all positive. So I think it'll be interesting to see how people react to his case just as a player and not considering him as the guy that he's been after his career.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jared, thank you so much for joining us again. And everyone can, of course, we're at hardwoodparoxysm.com. You can find our podcast there. And please leave a rating and review for all the HP Network podcasts and for our feed as well, Over and Back NBA. Either one is good, both if possible. And you can find us on Twitter and Facebook at Over and Back NBA, and also our forums at overandbacknba.com, where we can talk a lot about classic basketball. So thanks everyone for listening, and back in soon.